The Honorable Fabel Williams, Minister of Energy and Technology, MP for St. Andrew Eastern Constituency. Professor Ian Boxill, Deputy Principal of the UWI. Dr. Camille Bell Hutchinson, Registrar of UWI Mona Campus. Dr. David McBean, Director of MSBM. Professor Helen Asemoto, Professor of Basic Medical Sciences and representative from FST. Then I have, of course, Dean. I'm going to introduce you last, Dean, don't worry. You're one of us right now at this point. Dean Waibinte Warboko of the Faculty of Humanities and Education for the University of West Indies Mona Campus. Former Deputy Principal Joe Pereira, Mr. Len Kelly, current President of the Incorporated Master Builders Association of Jamaica, Mr. Carvel Stewart, former past President of the Incorporated Master Builders Association of Jamaica, Mrs. Priscilla Deans, STEM Coordinator of the Ministry of Education, Mr. Sadford Billings, National Science Coordinator of the Ministry of Education, Dr. Damian Black, Director, Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, Deputy Deans, Heads of Departments, Directors of Institutes and Schools, a pleasant good evening to you all. Good evening. Welcome to the 4th Distinguished Faculty of Humanities and Education lecture. I officially welcome Professor Ian Boxill to bring greetings on behalf of the campus. I did want to set the stage and the tone for our very non-conventional, non-traditional, distinguished lecturer, Dr. Aldrin Sweeney. When we started the planning for this, one thing Aldrin was adamant about was that this would be non-traditional. So what we decided to do was as best as possible to incorporate not just the academics, and this is not going to be just an academic conversation, but we wanted to also include the policymakers as well as the industry. And so we have done that tonight. You will see at the start of the program that we will open up with some fireside chats, which are brief lounge discussions to kind of enthrall, entice, and whet your appetite for what is about to come. And then leading off into the Q&A, we want to start with the future directions and implications for setting the tone and the pace forward for STEM agenda in Jamaica. Sounds good? This will be a dialogical discourse. We want questions and answers, we want solutions, and we want a way forward. So with that said, I am going to welcome to the podium Professor Ian Boxill, Deputy Principal for the Mona Campus.
Okay, so good evening, and Dr. Stewart, thank you for helping me out. So I can say that having observed all the protocols,
thank you.
Let me, however, thank the Dean, Professor Wariboko, for leading the faculty in this very important discussion. I look forward to the discussion today, as I'm sure all of you. And also let me apologize on behalf of Professor Weber, who, as you all know, is a strong advocate of STEM and has been supporting it for a long time at the university. Professor Weber is unable to be here today because he's traveling on the other side of the world, as the registrar knows. I'm not even going to say where because it's so far, but I think he'll take 2 days to get back here. So, but he has indicated that he's in strong support of this distinguished lecture. And let me also congratulate Dr. Sweeney, who will be leading the discussions today. And I asked him if he was related to another famous. I know all of the Sweeneys that I know are very famous and distinguished. So I don't know, there's something about the name. So we'll hear more about that today. Let me also, I had an opportunity to read the article, your article in the Gleaner, where you spoke about a STEM center. And I should like to hear more about that. I know, again, that Principal Weber has such an interest, and I would like to know that at the end of this discussion that there's something I can say to him about this discussion today regarding the STEM Center. One of the things I would like to say before I step away, because my job is to say welcome, but one of the things I would like to say to you is that, well, I want to really congratulate Dean Wariboko because, and Dr. Stewart knows about this, because I'm telling you, as chair of ACWAC, every meeting, the Faculty of Humanities and Education brings no less than 5 or 6 programs or courses to be approved.
No, he's right. He's
And
right.
I'm warning you that you're overworking ACWAC because they have basically taken over. And I mean, I've had to say this to them, that in our last meeting of ACWAC, the agreement was that the 2 faculties that take up most of the time, Humanities and Education, followed by Engineering, that they would supply lunch for the members of ACWAC. And believe it or not, thank you for the few cookies and, that you sent. But we really want to thank Engineering because they provided a wonderful spread. Hint, hint, for next time. But I say that because what I'm seeing in the faculty, and I'm sure I've heard this from other colleagues, the innovation in terms of the new programs and the way of thinking about STEM, where there's a lot of talk about creatives like who work for places like Google and Facebook, and these are the large companies. So no longer are we separating persons who work in the humanities from the persons who work in the so-called sciences. I mean, and initially, it was never like this, but we've sort of compartmentalized ourselves, but we're somehow coming back together and recognize that humanities are somehow connected and form the foundation for these STEM subjects. One last thing I would like to say is that years ago when we were setting up the School of Business, a group of us, we were sent to speak to the deans of business schools across the United States. I had the opportunity to go with 2 other colleagues to University of Michigan, and we spoke to the dean of the University of Michigan, and we asked him if there were any specific type of qualifications they were looking for before they accepted someone into the MBA programs. And he said that they preferred persons who had a background in either engineering or the humanities. Those 2 areas. Now, of course, engineering and humanity, they might seem very different, but he said that they brought a sort of critical thinking that the other persons didn't take with them into the program. So I thought this was very interesting, and we did the research, and we found that this was widespread across all of the business schools. So I say that to say that I think we're moving in the right direction, where we bring this all together, and I think humanities is in the right faculty to sort of lead this discussion on STEM. So having said that, I want to again welcome you all on behalf of the university, those of you from the outside and those of you on the inside. I hope that we all have a wonderful, riveting, enthralling, exciting discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you. Dean, at this time, would you like to bring greetings?
Good evening, friends. Good evening, colleagues. The deputy principal alluded to the faculty literally bombarding his committee with new programs and new courses. We are, as a faculty, at the crossroads. We either rebrand ourselves and survive, or in a matter of time, our classrooms will be so denuded of students that we will be forced to close down. That isn't what we want to do. We believe that part of that intellectual energy and part of that qualification as intellectuals is to be able to rise up to the challenges that might present itself from time to time as we grow through time as a faculty. The distinguished lectures were conceived against the background of what previously existed in this faculty. And I'm very glad to recognize Mr. Joe Pereira two-time dean of the faculty and former deputy principal of the Mona campus. I like telling this story. When I joined 23 years ago, during his deanship, every Friday we were assembled here and individuals gave lectures on specific aspects of Caribbean identity, Caribbean culture, Caribbean history. And at the time, that was going to be part of the permanent academic calendar of the faculty, and that these were going to be published. Well, it never was. When we conceived of the distinguished lectures as part of the processes of rebranding, it was also with the idea that what we had started several years ago under Joe Pereira was now going to take the form that it has taken. And so quickly, as soon as we went through the first 3 lectures, I was emboldened to invite Joe Pereira to edit these lectures. And this afternoon, he's finished the editing. He's written a powerful introduction. I went through it. I'm not going to say anything about it. The UWI Press has agreed to publish these lectures. Dr. Paul is here. He's also in receipt of what Joe has sent across. The expectation is that by means of these lectures and what we know to be happening in the various faculties, we will sustain the robust research culture that this faculty has been known for. The event today is a continuation of what I've just said. So it is also going to be published, and actually we had said to him, as soon as he's finished, taking advantage of the discussions, which will provide something like a manuscript peer review of some sort. All these will be incorporated in readiness for another round of publication. So, I feel convinced that we are on the cusp of doing something, that we are on the cusp of rebranding this faculty, rejuvenating the energy that we require for our survival. We have in the last 4 years, now as I speak to you, introduced 5 new undergraduate programs plus 2 postgraduate MA programs. And all of these are the non-traditional humanities programs as we know it. BA in Cultural and Creative Industries, BA in Film Studies. We are, as I speak with you, planning a program in creative writing and publishing, BA in History and Journalism, and arrangements are also in place. The head of history is here. Hopefully, by the time all of these are in place, and given time for its maturity, for it to sink into the market, we would have sufficiently re-advertised and rebranded ourselves. We have embarked on a very aggressive marketing campaign, multifaceted. And that was part of what the deputy principal was referring to, the publication in the Gleaner last Sunday. It's been going on for 2 years. We've reached a point where each of these little things that we do are expected to converge at some point to provide for us the salvation that I'm speaking about. So ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to the faculty. I'm glad that you could find time to come because of the inclement weather that we are facing. I am very, very confident that my colleague will deliver. We took a deliberate decision that, except it's impossible, we are not going to seek anybody in the initial stages to give any of these distinguished lectures because they say character begins at home. And we must be sufficiently confident that as a faculty, we have the intellectual resources to redeem ourselves. If we don't, we close down. If we have, then we must tell the public that we have. And so all of the lecturers that we have chosen, except the one that preceded this one, which had to do with digital humanities, had been taken from within the faculty. Caroline Cooper on creative industries, Deborah Hicklin on creative industries, Hopton Dunn on communication and ICT related things, and a guy from Columbia, I can't remember his name now, who did the digital humanities, and then now Sweeney. Sweeney, the fate of the faculty is in your hands. As you speak to us this evening, and I know that you will not disappoint us. Welcome everyone to the faculty.
Thank you, Dean. At this time, we're going to move into, our fireside chat, and I'm going to welcome to the stage, in no particular order, Dr. Camille Bell Hutchinson to take a seat, Mr. Len Kelly. I will introduce each of them as they take their seats. Mrs. Priscilla Deans and Mr. Safford Billings. Bennett. Apologies. Dr. Camille Bell Hutchinson is not only our campus registrar, but prior to such, she is a known mathematician. She was also a former deputy dean in the Faculty of Humanities and Education, as well as a mathematics education consultant. Hello, Professor Michael Taylor. You come right in, because you're going to be in my STEM in Conversation segment. Just come right in. She's also a former chief examiner for CXC CSEC, and she has significant experience, of course, in mathematics teaching and just a simple passion for excellence. Welcome, Dr. Camille Bell Hutchinson. Next to Dr. Bell Hutchinson is Mr. Len Kelly, who is the current president of the Incorporated Master Builders Association of Jamaica. He was a former past president of Jamaica Institution of Engineers. He is a registered professional civil engineer, and he is a proud graduate of the University of the West Indies. Welcome, Mr. Kelly. Next to Mr. Kelly is Mrs. Priscilla Deans, who is the National STEM Coordinator for the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information. Welcome, Mrs. Priscilla Deans. Last but not least, Mr. Safford Bennett. Forgive me for mispronouncing your last name. He's a National Science Coordinator at the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, and got his calling to the podium within 5 minutes of arriving this evening from his colleague, Mrs. Dean. So thank you very much. Each of our, as you can see, we have an academic who has, if you have read it, you should read it, the math policy that she co-led or led in 2013, as that is being used, of course, to inform our math directions today. So that's from the academic/policy side. We also have an industry expert as well as the policy experts. This was intentional to get the conversation to be across the board and not just within the halls of academia. They were all prompted with questions to think about, and I'm going to reiterate those questions for you all. The first was more directed towards mathematics, looking at the National Standards Curriculum and the introduction of PEP. Specifically, Dr. Bell Hutchinson, do you believe that there are steps, these are the steps in keeping with developing a comprehensive STEM education agenda in Jamaica? And we do have microphones for you guys, so I apologize. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this working?
Yeah. They can turn it. It isn't? Apologies, mic people. Let's try this one. Here you go.
Okay, right.
Yes.
So let me apologize for my voice. I'm coming down with something, and trust me, if it wasn't for Sarah, I wouldn't be here this evening. Yes, so I apologize for the voice. And I didn't know I'd been in such auspicious company at all. So, yeah, I was asked to look at, it says, given the recent changes in the National Standards Curriculum and the introduction of PEP, do you believe these steps are in keeping with developing a comprehensive STEM education agenda in Jamaica? Now, as I heard that Aldrin wanted a non-conventional, non-traditional approach, I don't think my answer is going to be very traditional nor expected. Because this is not a yes-no answer at all. I think as I looked at it that we want to think about what do we all commonly understand by STEM education. We want to think about what are the mechanisms in place to to ensure that this approach to STEM education is unified across the nation. We want to think about teachers. You know, one of the things I said to colleagues when we moved from GSAT to PEP is that on Friday, the teachers were teaching GSAT, and on Monday, they were teaching PEP. How do we, in that kind of scenario, expect a difference in approach, a difference in understanding, and not chaos? Now, with STEM education, we have to be careful, in my view, before I even answer the question, to not just jump on a bandwagon, because it has such deeper implications for not just for, it ends us with our nation, but with our students and the confusion that can stem, no pun intended, from a lack of understanding of how to approach STEM education. A lack of understanding of what technology really means, because what I have found in talking to teachers, that technology for them is all about computers. Not about building, not about designing, not about putting things together, not about making things, and therefore not about enabling our students to become the thinkers we want as they're in the classrooms, making mistakes so they can design better, making this mistakes so they can come together better in understanding mathematics. And so I would want to start by saying, yes, there is an obviously good direction with our national standards curriculum and PEP, because one should feed from the other. PEP is really supposed to be an assessment of a process. And that process is trying to enable our students to develop better thinking skills, better problem solving skills, and so on. But my argument has always been that that is what education is about anyway. That if we approached education the way we ought to approach education, STEM is a byproduct. Because it means that in our natural way of teaching, we will be engaging students in such a way that they are allowed to be creative, they are not given traditional questions, they are not taught by rote, they are allowed to make mistakes. One of the things I'm encouraging teachers to do when we're in classes now is to say to students, it's not that I can't do maths, I can't do this yet. Yet is an important word, because you will be able to do it when you are appropriately exposed and you have the correct experiences. So the national standard curriculum is trying to have more project-based learning, is trying to have students more exposed to problem solving, is trying to enable them to think rather than to be told. And that is what PEP is supposed to be doing. I have had a hard task trying to convince teachers that the performance task in PEP is not a subject in the curriculum. Performance task is just an outcome of learning. So when we're teaching fractions, we don't regurgitate a half plus a half is 1, because we don't understand the concept of a half. But we give situations where students can apply that knowledge in a way that demonstrates their understanding. That is a performance task. But my work with teachers now is showing panic, because they have to have a topic in the curriculum called performance task. And so where I would want to go in answer to you, Saran, about is this the right thing to do, is to say that unless we come with a very clearly defined, structured program of professional development, STEM or anything else will go nowhere. Right. It will go, and the literature tells you that. It shows that the fundamental aspect of performance with our students is going to rest with our teachers. Now, does Jamaica, does the Ministry of Education have the wherewithal to do the kind of continuous professional development that is required to make STEM real, to make teaching real? Because that, to me, is the greatest deterrent to achieving our educational goals with STEM and with everything else.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Actually would invite Mrs. Deans to respond to that very question.
Well, I could only say ditto with what was how she had responded, because it is true. It is so important. And I remember when you talk about even the fraction part. I remember me teaching fractions at a prep school after I did I went to Michael college, and I was teaching fraction using face painting. And there was a parent who could not understand, how is it that my child is going to actually learn fraction by face painting? And if all of us remember, fraction is not an easy thing to do, especially as we step up, you know, persons who are not mathematically inclined. So we have to bring, So we have to bring real life situations into the classroom. So there are a number of things that we had to make real for these students. And what the Ministry of Education is doing is starting very early where STEM is concerned. And that is why the national standards curriculum has been stemmed from the primary level straight up to grade 9. Where CXC is concerned, where we have actually started the implementation in terms of piloting 9 schools in 9 high schools, really, 8 technical, 1 non-technical. So the curriculum per se, or the syllabus, it doesn't have the word STEM in there. So we are working, the person from CXC is here. So we will be doing some more work with CXC in terms of stemming the syllabus for CXC so that we are bringing in the real world situation into the classroom. And what we're going after also is a lot of the research and development that is needed. Students do not have to wait until they get into the workplace for them to understand a concept. We're wanting to bridge a gap between school and workforce.
Excellent. Just to shift a little bit from education into industry. Sorry if you can't hear me. To industry. Mr. Kelly, I had prompted you with a question just about 24 hours ago. What are the needs of the industry to advance a comprehensive STEM education agenda in Jamaica?
All right, thank you, Sharon. And thank you for inviting me to fill in because Daddy he's a lot more knowledgeable in these things. But good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
The first, the practice of engineering first, and there are dozens of different disciplines of engineering, and I was looking at your nanotechnology. There's that branch of engineering. There's the biotech. There's a whole. It's extremely wide. But so what we try to do in our industry is to narrow it down to what affects us mostly. We can't really look at everything. Now, in terms of, we have some norms. There are some political practices, there are some societal norms, and geographically where we are. So there's a range of things that affect us, that make us unique. Now, and I have to kind of look to what the issues are before we come to why we need a STEM. I mean, it is pretty much in the analysis. You don't just say, okay, find a reason for a STEM. So we are subject to fortunately, in the region, there's volcanic activity. And we get not just wind events, but because we are pretty much coastal, then there are the wave actions, the marine events. Now, what is required for us is not, we have constantly been reacting to a lot of the things. And market, disasters will come. But let me go to the political norms and some of the cultural practices and the societal norms that seem to exacerbate certain issues. Because of how we are politically, we plan in 4-year cycles. Now, if you are a developing economy, if you just plan for the university only in 4-year cycles, and then when I'm done, start another 4-year cycle, I can't say where the university will be. So imagine the scale of a country.
So that is a problem for us. We have been doing some analysis, and just this past month, we met with the Faculty of Engineering here at Mona. We met with the Faculty of Engineering and the construction people at UTech, and we met with HART. These are the entities that largely train for the industry in which we operate. There's no connection between what is planned for the country and what the output from the educational institutions are, where it concerns engineering and construction. There's none. Because, simply put, the political norms is a quick 4-year cycle. So we turn up today and we say, okay, we're going to build some road, we're going to put in that road, and we're going to move some stuff over there, put in a toll road, and put in some houses right there. And you get that. It doesn't even allow us, the practitioners in the industry, to plan to be able to access some of these. So that leads to people from other shores coming here because they say, we're not ready. Nobody told you to be ready. So we have to look carefully, we have to analyze carefully what the practices are that cause some of the problems that beset us. Now, in terms of what is needed, there are obviously efficiencies required. Because of the uniqueness of some of what we face, it requires some deeper research based on where we are. So you're building a house on the coast. You're not just worrying about wave action from when you get a hurricane and you might get a tsunami. You're worrying about an earthquake also, which is a dummy one. The guy who is on the coastline in Florida only worrying about a hurricane. He don't have to consider anything about an earthquake. And so when we are analyzing, we have to look at these things. There are some other practices, and I'm trying to just be as practical as possible. Our people are accustomed to capturing land. Them don't like being termed squatters, but them don't mind the capture part because them say Columbus probably did the same thing. Now, in the capture of land, what that is what you call unplanned occupation or unplanned development. So let us say you have a hill behind the Mona Reservoir, and some people decide that they want to capture it. You end up with this scenario. The political practices, okay, them capture it up is about 400 of them up there that can swing the vote in this constituency. So make we give them some water, run 2 pipe, and we have cook some curry goat. No, I'm not alluding to anything in Eastern Portland. And so some things come with it which appears to legitimize the action. It appears to legitimize the action. And as I said, we have to look. Humanities come in play in these things too. It's not just a straight engineering construction thing. I just want you all to just look at in a deeper way. It comes all the way back to us. So there is now a project. Government said, listen, we need to regularize this squatting. So the engineers get together and you design. What you're designing now, is the most inefficient design you can have because you're not dealing with virgin territory. You have to design round fatty house and tall man little hut. And so you, instead of having, let us say, 5 kilometers of road, you end up with 15 because you are developing backways. You are reacting. There's no proactivity. If you see the land there, when you see the first one come, just go in, let us say, okay, fine, let's look at this. Can we allow them to occupy? Let us put in, let us be efficient in our way. Get these in. I leave the humanities people and the people who lecture in government to deal with the political practices. On our end where we have to find a solution, there are some places the best solution is still extremely painful for a society like ours. It's extremely expensive. When you go first world, They identify where development will go, where you put factories, where you put residential, and so on. And so it's structured. So they spend the least. We who can least afford it spend the most. So we need thinkers, we need analysis, we need proper research, we need critical thinking, and we need a thinking that is not just, I will argue, it's not just science, technology, mathematics, and engineering. It's not just STEM. It's about how you include all the other practices in there. You realize we don't really, what do social workers do? Usually when you perhaps have an orphan somewhere and they turn up and them come on if you're trying to adopt them or something. These people should be in these areas early. Identify what the problems are. It's a huge mix. I'm not trying to load everything on you, but it's really a lot to do. And I hope, just based on the perspective I've brought, it will cause us to what ails us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. When Mr. Bennett spoke earlier to me, he had to rush to the airport to pick up his lovely wife. And so I'm conscious of your time. And so just to comment on what do you believe from a national science and STEM perspective are the future implications for the STEM agenda in Jamaica?
Well, if we first look at the National Standards Curriculum, which is really the driver of science and STEM for future, the design of the curriculum encapsulated the science and engineering practices. And so it's no longer a situation where, you know, students are expected to study the eye and the parts of the eye. And when you're finished studying the parts of the eye, it's no different from studying a poem or reading another text, because the skills involved are not really science skills. So in incorporating those science and engineering practices and teaching the science content through the practices, and also where the evaluation of students is built within the practices, it's a totally different ball game. But then, as my colleague said earlier, you teach for GSAT on Friday, and then you teach for PEP on Monday, and how different it is. So it's a continuing struggle, and we envisage that in another 2 years, we should be getting someplace in this regard.
Okay, all right. So with that, I'm conscious of time and our distinguished lecturers. I do want to give a round of applause to our panelists to kind of engage us in the start of the conversation.
I just say though,
of course,
on behalf of MSET, that is the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology, the Ministry of Education, we partner a lot with that ministry. And we're also in partnership with a committee, National Council on Science and Technology with Professor Errol Morrison. So we do a lot of work. Just today we had a meeting, and we are actually planning, just to give you a little bit of insight of what's happening, we're dealing with the popularization of science and technology in Jamaica. And one of the objectives is really to push the research, development, and entrepreneurial spirit in the agenda in Jamaica here with our young people. One of the things that we spoke about when you talk about squatting on lands, we also follow through STEM. We also follow the ECG objectives, the economic growth objectives, and one of them, it speaks about agri-parks market. Now, for our schools, about 5 of the schools that do agriculture, the ones in the rural area, they sit on like over 200 acres of land. Don't know what to do with half of the land. There are squatters. So what is STEM suggesting? What is the Ministry of Education suggesting? that some of these lands be used as agri-parks market. And so we are also pushing the agenda in terms of building smart houses. So students who are in construction, they work with the students in plumbing, they work with the students in electrical installation, so that we can build a smart house to fit the size of the fatty that you talk about, and the slim, the slim one. So, and also to accommodate persons with special needs. That's big on our agenda. And we're also doing some work with the fire brigade, because we're wanting the fire brigade also to become or to be seen as a lucrative industry. Too often students think about going into the fire brigade because there's nothing else to do. That industry is a STEM industry. It's a STEM industry, and we're pushing that agenda for students to look at 21st century skills in a different way. We don't want to be pushing the traditional skills, and that is why I work with the National Council on Science and Technology. This work with Professor Miller is very important, and we're wanting Jamaica every step of the way. We talk to people outside of, you know, in the educational sector. When we speak to other people, and I must say this, big up Grace Kennedy. Grace Kennedy has a STEM center, and they're doing very well. And we're asking you to think about, the engineers, think about having some STEM centers for engineers, have some STEM centers for some architects, and the list goes on and on and on. So there are a number of things happening, and we're just wanting to, for the University of West Indies to continue to partner with the Ministry of Education, because it's not easy, especially trying to transform the minds of some of the teachers, moving away from this rigid, you know, mindset to a more growth mindset. And that is what we're trying to do.
All right. At this time, please let's give a rounding applause to our panelists one more time for a fireside chat. Thank you so much. Mr. Kelly, you know, you guys can start up with POPs, the next engineering center for STEM. All right. Without further ado, it is my privilege to read his very modest bio. I tried to find some other interesting gimmicks, but I'm going to start it off because he gave me strict instructions about his bio. Hailing from the beautiful shores of Dominica, Dr. Sweeney received his PhD in science education from Florida State University. I will not tell you when. And has taught at institutions across the globe, in the United States, the United Kingdom, and of course throughout the Caribbean. He has served as a funding proposal reviewer and science education consultant for none other than the very prestigious United States National Science Foundation, and also as an invited member of the Science Content Experts Review Panel for the Florida Department of Education. Dr. Sweeney is the co-editor of the Nanoscale Science and Engineering Education book published by the American Scientific Publishers. And I believe that is the text that had a foreword by a Nobel laureate. Congratulations. Dr. Sweeney has served as an editorial board member for the Journal of Research in Science Teaching and the Journal of Science Teacher Education, respectively, and also has served as a peer reviewer for a number of journals, including that I will name in particular the Caribbean Curriculum out of St. Augustine, the Caribbean Journal of Education, and is the guest editor along with Dr. Lois George for the first ever STEM in Education special issue that will be coming out in July. Thank you. It is my esteemed privilege to welcome to the stage the fourth distinguished lecturer to taking STEM in education to the next level, Dr. Aldrin Sweeney.
Does it work?
You turn it on?
Just make sure it's on.
It is
so
on.
much for STEM. All right, let's take this off. Ladies and gentlemen, all right, good evening. All right, I think you have heard several times now that I'm not a conventional lecturer, and I think that's become quite apparent at this point. I also, before I begin, would formally like to thank Dean Wariboko and Associate Dean Stewart for inviting me to give this lecture. It's quite an honor to be asked to do, and I'm very grateful for that. Let me also, at this point, also say I am planning to speak for approximately an hour. Right, now I see the crestfallen heads. And I have several of my graduate students in the room, so they will tell you that I usually prepare this much. And I say, we'll be finished in about an hour and a half. And then we end up going for about 3 hours, but that's because of dialogue and input and discussion. Now, so I'll give a lecture, but I'm hoping that primarily it will be a forum, a medium for really promoting a lot of thought, debate, discussion, and a way forward. I really do not wish this. Yes, it's good to talk. Yes, it's good to discuss, but we'd like for something concrete to emerge from this. Now, as for having the fate of the faculty in my hands, I really don't know how to respond to that. However, I'll come back to that point. As you will see shortly. Here's an overview. Can everybody see this clearly? Here is an overview. I won't read through the overview. It's taken a slightly different direction to the abstract I submitted. However, I am very pleased that with the fireside chat that occurred just now, many of the comments that were made overlap with the material that I prepared to discuss this evening. So there is a good level of alignment already. And if I might ask, let me double check my own. Right, so if we can put these on silent or vibrate. Right, take about 10 minutes rather, just to give a background. Just to give a background of where we are. I'll begin with some of the formalities, a definition. And I know most people, when you come to a lecture, you don't really wish to hear a formal definition. You want to get into the meat of the matter. However, in speaking with one of the young lady who very helpfully distributed the brochures outside, Miss Wallace, I believe her name is, we were speaking briefly, and it occurred to me just in our brief exchange, neither I, you, nor anybody else can assume that we know what STEM means. So it's not just the part of a flower. So I actually did need to explain it's an acronym: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We use the term so regularly, we use the term so frequently, we assume people know all about it. That's not necessarily the case. Now, STEM and STEM education, of course, is all the rage. We're having a whole lecture on this, and of course, it is the focus for our national standards curriculum. It's infused into our national standards curriculum. The idea, the concept is not new. In fact, I can see Dr. Rainford. This is my first non-conventional comment. I can see Dr. Rainford out of the corner of my eye, and she confirmed for me earlier this week, was it this week or last week? So I'll say it anyway. I can see you smiling. The term has existed, I hope I pronounce it properly. The term has existed almost as long yes, almost as long as when Wappy killed Philip. All right. So it has existed for a while. It's now been reinvigorated. It's now on vogue again. And we at the UWI, I think we're on the right track. There are certain things that do need to occur, and I think I'll provide some suggestions this evening about where I think the Faculty of Humanities and Education ought to go, and where the university ought to go, in terms of moving forward with this STEM agenda. Okay, it's an intentional integration of the 4 individual disciplines, which I think is clear to everybody at this point. I'll make that assumption at this point. This is the background material. This is again providing the background material, and it emphasizes one of the first issues being there is no consistent, agreed upon definition of what STEM education actually is. So we all have our individual conceptions, we all have our individual understandings, we all have our own individual ways of this is how we think it ought to be done. But in the field, the growing field, the developing field, there still is no consensus. Right. For this evening, I will use a definition that Kelly and Knowles propose. I find that to be quite interesting, quite useful in my own thinking, my own teaching, my own research in the area. And as they do, I will go ahead and define integrated STEM education as the approach to teaching 2 or more of these content areas. 2 or more. Now, there might be disagreement with that, and I expect some level of disagreement. My goal here is to be somewhat provocative, as you'll see in about 5 or 10 minutes. Is to be somewhat provocative, challenge some of the conventional ways of seeing things locally, regionally, internationally. This just further explains the different ways of seeing STEM or conceptualizing what STEM is. At its simplest level, at its most basic level, you're looking at these as 4 independent disciplines, which personally doesn't, to me, make much sense. It doesn't make sense conceptually. It doesn't make sense pedagogically. But some people, some persons do still conceive of science is here, technology is here, engineering is here, mathematics is here. Right. There is no real progress that can occur in thinking that way, and that's a personal opinion. Of course, we can also think of these as in different combinations, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, as explained. Again, this is some of the background. I wish to go somewhat beyond this. And at this point, let me just move beyond the definitions, and as you all know, the University of the West Indies has a very clear interest in defining STEM, in making sure that that there are a number of students, a specific proportion of students every year who graduate from STEM disciplines. The next few slides I've pulled from the Statistical Digest, simply to show that the university itself has this great interest in defining who the students are, from which disciplines they've graduated, and how to change things. I'll explain that in a moment. So just taking a look at 2011, 2012 through 2015, 16, you can see that the approximate distribution remains the same over that 5-year period. About a third of students were enrolled in STEM, and approximately 2/3 were non-STEM majors. That still needs to be defined. I'm not going to give that definition. One can go to the Statistical Digest and find those definitions. At this point, I simply wanted to give an overview of where the university is currently in terms of enrollments, in terms of outputs, and moving forward. Again, this is background material. I wish to move forward now to the extent of the importance of how this is seen in the region. Given the most recent information, the data, the comments by the Vice Chancellor now make sense. If I go back very quickly, just in terms of the outputs of first degrees. In fact, if you scan this, I've taken from those data and just given the summaries at the end. So you'll see that But I've put these together in terms of engineering, medical sciences, science and technology, and food and agriculture. You see that about approximately 40%. Approximately 40% of first degree graduates are within those STEM fields. Right. With that context in mind, in 2016, the Vice Chancellor made a statement that by the year 2020, which is next year, by the way, by the year 2020, the University of the West Indies ought to be graduating, should be graduating, has the intention of graduating at least 50% of its graduates in STEM fields. Now, there are various administrators here at the university. I personally am not sure of the extent to which that is going to be achieved by 2020. Right, and we can have that discussion. We can have that discussion soon. Again, not reading through each of these, but you'll see Grenada Prime Minister Dr. Keith Mitchell speaking on behalf of the heads of CARICOM government, saying that ICT and STEM are at the heart of what we need to accomplish, and perhaps somewhat more ominously, somewhat more strongly worded, strongly stated, the statement in 2016 from the then Education Minister, Mr. Thwaites, and just the part in red that Jamaica is going nowhere, and for emphasis, nowhere, unless we can increase our competence in the various fields of science, both pure and applied. So we know what the situation is in terms of where we want to be, where we are. Just a few other comments, just to provide the context. Are we all familiar with Professor Ventura? I know about Ventura. Right, not very many people are familiar with Professor Ventura. He has served over an extensive period of time as an advisor to various governments of Jamaica. And I found his comment very interesting, that if Jamaica wishes to obtain or to achieve first world status, if Jamaica intends to achieve first world status, is that going to be possible without, first of all, becoming involved, becoming knowledgeable of these fields such as robotics, artificial intelligence, genomics, biotechnologies? And when I came across that statement, you can imagine my excitement. Some of you can imagine my excitement. Those of you who haven't yet seen me excited will do so shortly, because when I saw that statement, it seemed to me to, this is exactly the type of thinking, this is exactly the type of goals that I personally would wish to see expressed within the University of the West Indies, and which I would like to see expressed more forcefully throughout, not just locally, not just nationally, but throughout the region. Okay. I also must take the time to mention the work of Professor Cardinal Ward. And I'm hoping that there are some of us in the audience this evening who are familiar with Professor Ward's work, because he has done a great deal. He's actually influenced my thinking quite extensively in terms of how one can move ahead and set some goals, set some tangible goals for STEM education without necessarily depending on governmental input. Right, now, the role of government, of course, is important. Right, the role of government, one would assume, is to guide and shape and influence. But government cannot always be responsible or has the capacity to make everything happen. Professor Ward is one example of a person who, very enthusiastic, very energetic. If you can see the graphic that's there, those represent a number of private entities, semi-private entities, that he has approached in order to move forward his vision of how STEM education ought to be structured, ought to be developed, ought to be promoted within the Caribbean region. He's the president of what's called CADSTI, the Caribbean Diaspora for Science, Technology, and Innovation, which is an umbrella, so to speak, for the Caribbean Science Foundation. Right, I can see Mrs. Deans from the corner of my eye nodding, so I know that you are familiar with Professor Ward's work. I've taken the liberty of using 2 of the slides from a presentation he gave in 2016. I couldn't explain it any better, and I thought that if there were any persons in the audience who were not familiar with his work, this would be an ideal time to promote that work. I think this would be an ideal forum to do that. So just to bring your attention to the goals. So the goals of the Caribbean Science Foundation: STEM-based education reform, technology-based entrepreneurism, which, well, let me hold my comments on that, because I'll make some comments on that later. And SPICE, the Student Program for Innovation in Science and Engineering. Right, this is the signature program for the Caribbean Science Foundation. Many of us will have heard of SPICE. I'm looking to see if there are a few nodding heads, but this simply tells me that we need to become more aware of these types of initiatives. I know Professor Ward has been in contact with a number of governments. He's been in contact with a number of regional institutions and organizations. And yet it does seem that the work is known to a few key people, but still needs to receive broader exposure. 4 weeks of total immersion for selected students, and the students have to meet academic criteria where they're taken to particular locations, STEM-based locations, and immersed in these types of activities. There have been some critiques. Some have called it elitist, although it's based on academic merit. Again, this is providing some of the background for some of the particular types of initiatives which are actually occurring and which we may wish to emulate, and we may wish to modify, and may wish to become involved in. Okay. Right. The fireside chat earlier focused on some of these, directly and indirectly. And Professor Ward has made 7 suggestions about promoting a culture of STEM in the Caribbean to do. Here are the 7 suggestions. And as I move forward through my prepared comments for the evening, I will discuss where we in the Faculty of Humanities and Education are trying to emphasize and trying to move forward in terms of those first 3 recommendations. All right. In thinking about, that certainly went in order. In thinking about how I wanted to structure this talk, I wanted to provide some kind of a larger context in some areas. I wanted to focus on national issues, regional issues, international issues. Now the title that you'll see is the impact of NBIC, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science, and implications for developing countries. You'll note that we haven't mentioned that yet. We're moving in that direction. Before we move in that direction, what are some of the immediate concerns in terms of STEM and STEM education for Jamaica? Well, here are 2. There are several, but here are 2. And if you take a look at the graph to my left, the value of food imports to Jamaica between the years 2007 to 2019, and that's measured in billions of Jamaican dollars, by the way. I had to look twice when I obtained the graph, but it's obtained from Staten, so it's quite reliable. But you see that the graph is going this way. It's almost a straight line. Now, I find that perturbing. No doubt there are many reasons for this, economic reasons, political reasons. But here's a question. If that's a problem, could some form of STEM research, technology, biotechnology, be used to address this? And by saying that, I wish to suggest, and let me simply suggest it, might Jamaica, might other Caribbean countries wish to focus on the development of GM foods, genetically modified foods, which are suggested will reduce production costs, increase productivity, and reduce national dependency on external, in terms of importing food staples from abroad. I'm asking that as a rhetorical question for now. I'm hoping that somebody will actually address it, whether you agree or disagree. Dr. West, Paul West, some may know, posed a question: how do we use STEM disciplines to inculcate an entrepreneurial spirit in terms of areas that are undeveloped? And he asked about water, roads, and energy. Again, I'm going to pose that as a question, which I hope, again, might be addressed following my address. Right. I paused and I wondered whether to include this. And I decided to go ahead and include it. Because we talk a lot about STEM. We talk a lot about how STEM is needed. We talk a lot about the good that STEM can achieve. To the layperson, though, does STEM actually address any of the key day-to-day immediate problems that are faced? I would suggest not. And if one of the immediate day-to-day pressing problems faced, certainly in this country, and not only in this country, but across the Caribbean also, is crime, violence, let me suggest, and perhaps this is being provocative, one of our prominent lecturers here at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Gale, his research indicates a strong positive relationship between generational poverty and social violence. I have some of my graduate students in the room who have taken a research methods course with me, so they will know that the language one needs to use here must be very carefully expressed. Right, so correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. Okay. If there's also a growing body of evidence that technology-based solutions can play a role in reducing extreme poverty, then might there be a link? Might there be a link? If there's a focus on STEM, applications, could that be a route, a path, however indirect, to addressing the issues of crime and violence? Let me segue from that. Again, as I said, I wanted to speak about some big issues, some big topics. And moving from some of the big picture areas nationally, I'd like to make a few comments about the Faculty of Humanities and Education. Right, now, I'm aware that the Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities and Education is seated directly in front of me. But I remember, I'm not sure if the Dean will remember, I remember very clearly when I was being interviewed for a position at the University of the West Indies. And I remember in the interview, Professor Griffith, Professor Wariboko, and a number of other faculty number of other persons in the Faculty of Humanities and Education. And I remember a question that was asked of me, I gave a response which I thought would be quite adequate. My response was challenged by none other than the dean. And I thought to myself, it wasn't face-to-face, we were doing this via Skype or whatever it was. So I'm at home in Dominica. I was in Dominica. By the way, I'm from Montserrat, although I do love Dominica. So we were doing this via Skype, but don't remember if there was no visual, so it was by audio only, if I recall. So I'm there on the other end thinking, okay, what do I say to the doesn't offend him? He is the dean after all, I want this to go well. But I decided to be honest, and I disagreed with whatever it was that you said, I disagreed with it. And I disagreed, and I think your response, I think you were quite enthusiastic about that. So I say that because I'm curious about what your reaction might be. Not just your reaction, but all of us here who are from the Faculty of Humanities and Education. Keep in mind, I'm aware that this lecture series, one of the goals is to promote, is to make more visible the work of the members of faculty, members of staff within the Faculty of Humanities and Education. One of the goals is to show to the public, show to other members of the university how we add value to the university and to the society at large. Having said that, there are some of you who will recall this particular graphic, this particular invitation that appeared in our emails sometime in late January within the Faculty of Humanities and Education. And again, let me link that to some of the comments that were made earlier this evening, that the Faculty of Humanities and Education is at a crossroads. This came into my mailbox, an invitation to a meeting, transforming the humanities. I can actually look around the room and see many of the faces, several persons who were there. In particular, the question in the middle evoked a range of emotions in me. Can we all see the question in the middle there? And if you cannot, let me read it. One of the questions, there are 3 questions, and in order, how do we attract students to our subject areas? This is within the context of FHE. Has STEM undermined FHE programs? And how can we overcome the challenges? In quick succession, I think I went through the range of emotions of being surprised, bemused, confused, and then I think I finally understood. This is more of a philosophical argument. I think philosophically I might be one of the last few people who hold the view that the role of a university is a life of the mind, an academic stimulation and debate and so forth. And I've reluctantly come to realize, after teaching for 25 years, I've reluctantly come to realize that a university, whether it wants to be or not, actually is a business. So, the need to attract students to our programs. Has STEM undermined Faculty of Humanities and Education programs? In other words, are students electing not to become enrolled in our programs because they think that going elsewhere, pursuing another degree program is more prestigious, might result in greater prospects for employment, and so forth? That's how I actually understood that. John Horgan at the Stevens Institute of Technology addresses this issue very well. And essentially he says, the humanities have a role. The humanities have an indispensable role. The humanities and education cannot be ignored. And they provide this skepticism that's needed. This skepticism is especially important when it comes to claims about humanity, about what we are, where we came from, and even what we can and should be. So, my response of should we think of STEM as undermining FHE programs? No. I'm actually against that perspective. And here's why. Okay. The skepticism was expressed quite well, in fact, very well, and rightly so, by none other than our dean. Because in a publication that came out this year, I'll just read the last excerpt. To what extent can the new curricula of STEM education facilitate true education for the practice of freedom and development without humanities education and the social sciences? And that's a question with which I agree. Actually, I do agree with the sentiment and the question posed. So we have STEM, and we have all of the wonderful, supposedly wonderful attributes of STEM. But do STEM curricula actually play the role, fulfill the role of a true education? So educating a person, a child, an adult for full participation in civics, full participation in life, in society. So no, not fully. How can the Faculty of Humanities and Education play a role in this? I think it will be fairly, not necessarily easy, but I think with the will to do so, programs in our Faculty of Humanities and Education can take on board, can integrate, can infuse aspects of STEM education, not STEM, but the analysis of STEM, the analysis of STEM education, which I think our students, which I think our society is actually requesting. Some of the comments that were made earlier on. Engineers and those from the humanities are the types of students being sought after because of being able to think critically and to analyze and to look beyond face value. So you'll see what I've tried to do here is to point to certain areas, certain disciplines within the faculty that, in my mind at least, certainly can take on board aspects of STEM education and add value to their own offerings and attract more students into our programs. Linguistics easily comes to my mind very easily. For example, there's an ongoing debate. The debate has not yet been resolved. I don't know if it ever will be resolved, but there is an ongoing debate, not just in this country, in countries across the Caribbean. STEM disciplines, constituent STEM disciplines have their own language. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics have use very specialized language. Now, if the everyday language, the home language of student and teacher is not standard English, then how does one reconcile not using standard English and having to learn another set of specialized language? That there's a disconnect. So, to me, seems fairly obvious to me. I know it won't be something that's easy to do, but with the will to do so, could a linguistics program here at UWI, a linguistics program here at the University of the West Indies, not begin to undertake some type of research and study about how that could be addressed? The same goes for all of the discipline areas that I've indicated here. And please keep in mind, I had limited space on the slide, otherwise I could have fit several more program areas there. Yes, sorry, I anticipated that one. All right. Right. These are selected and primarily for space. Right. Right. The STEM agenda itself is undergoing critique. and not just from within, not just from non-STEM, not just from non-STEM areas. Critiques are also coming from within the STEM education community, within the science education community. One of the critiques is expressed, is articulated most adequately, most eloquently, I should say, by Dr. Smith at the University of, Caroline Smith at the University of Tasmania. And she and I have been in correspondence. I actually asked her to send an article to me, which she did very, very quickly, despite the, what was it, the 14-hour time difference, 12 or 14-hour time difference, and has asked for joint input from myself and Dr. Ferguson Murray. How do we respond to her critiques of STEM? Essentially, she says, we, internationally we, globally we, tend to accept very blindly and tend to accept very uncritically the wonders of STEM. And that we need to realize, we ought to realize that there always is an agenda, and that there always is an underlying motive, and that there always are questions that need to be asked. One of the questions that need to be asked is as follows. One needs to address the seeming oxymoron of sustainable development. How can economic development occur while maintaining sustainability? Right? And that's a question I've seen raised in several fora, but she again articulates it very, very clearly and gives us quite a lot to think about, in line with some of the earlier critiques, for example, that Professor Wariboko mentioned. Right. Let me change. One other thing that I do need to include here is that we are aware of the different variations now that exist. So we know of STEM. We also know that the National Standards Curriculum here in Jamaica is very much an advocate of STEAM, where the A indicates the inclusion of the arts, the necessary inclusion of the arts. There also is STREAM, the inclusion, the deliberate, explicit inclusion of reading. There are several more. My students can help me out. You've told me several of the other ones. So STEM, STEAM, STREAM. I also wish to speak about another variation, which is STEM with 2 M's, soon. And I have that in there deliberately, I have that in there for a particular reason. But a longtime colleague of mine, Professor Taylor, Peter Charles Taylor, we met over 25 years ago in Florida. Interestingly, he's now a professor of STEAM education. Right, so now this gives you an insight, this gives you some indication of how seriously this is being taken. Right, so this seems to be new or strange to some persons. It was quite strange to myself also. But yes, he's a professor of STEAM education, and in Australia, he's an Australian. He's based at Murdoch University at this stage of his career. He and other colleagues in Australia are very much in favor of, very much advocates of not referring to STEM. They say STEM is inadequate. We've moved beyond STEM. We now must think about inclusion of the arts in any discussion we have about science, technology, engineering, mathematics, because any discussion without inclusion of the arts and the humanities and the social sciences really is something very sterile and not really fit for analyzing the various issues that occur in society. So just wanted to include that, and with a nod to our Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, for specifically and deliberately including the A. This is being reflected internationally. This is not something that's, it's growing, it's becoming much more prevalent, and I think it's a good thing that we here have actually taken that on board very early. Okay. All right. Okay. That was a fairly long preamble. And as teachers, I'm sure there are a number of teachers in the room. When you're lecturing, you're teaching, you're trying to communicate something, you always have something going on in your mind. Well, if I do this, if I say this, this is the best way to. So that was a fairly long preamble, and it shouldn't have been so long. But I wanted to set the tone, set the background, because we now are ready for the excitement of the evening. Let me repeat that for emphasis. We now are ready for the excitement of the evening. Because this is exciting. This is exciting. Some of you will believe me, some of you won't. This is exciting. Take it back quickly to Professor Taylor. STEAM education leads to the development of socially responsible and culturally contextualized STEM education. Social responsibility and context. And so at this point, where we now can start to look and apply what he means by this social responsibility and cultural context. Because as if STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, as if those disciplines, the study of those disciplines, the teaching and learning of those disciplines, as if that wasn't exciting enough. I'm not seeing the agreement. As if that wasn't exciting enough, we now are at a point, we refer to them as emerging technologies. Some of these are not really new at all. They've been repackaged. So if there are any, I know there is at least one chemist in the room. If some of us are familiar with what we call supramolecular chemistry, really that's, you can think of that as nanotechnology. But nanotechnology as it is presented and taught now typically comes with this definition. So the study of materials within a particular size domain or size limit. So between 1 to 100 nanometers is the usual definition. And nanometers, for those who might not be aware, is 10 to the minus 9 meters. Very, very small. Extremely small. 10 to the minus 9 meters. Okay. Here's the interesting part. Here's the exciting part. Here's the exciting part. In regular chemistry, and I know I'm not teaching a chemistry class, but in normal chemistry, we can think of ourselves dealing with many bulk atoms at one point, at one time. With nanotechnology, more properly nanoscale science and engineering, we're working with much fewer components of matter. And at that scale, what happens is that at that scale, the behavior is different. At that scale, you also have the possibility of, I hesitate to use the word creating because that has a connotation. But at that scale, you have the possibility of preparing, let's use the word preparing, new materials with particular properties that you desire. So with designed properties. So that's all I'll say for nanotechnology, given that that's not the focus of the lecture, isn't really to go into the technical details. What I want to do is to show you some of the examples. Biotechnology, the purposeful engineering of biological processes, which can include genetic manipulation. Information technology, as defined here. Development, maintenance, and use of computer systems, etc., for processing and distribution of data, digital data, and cognitive science. So how does this work? How, why, to what extent? Here's the other exciting part. Nanotech, biotech, information technology, and cognitive science. So just as we now want to think prefer to think of science, technology, engineering, mathematics as we need to think of them as being integrated. Those are primary disciplines. Now the secondary disciplines, the emerging disciplines, the evolved disciplines also now are coming together, also now are converging. And here is where I'll pause. Here's where I'll pause so you can take this in. Now the diagram itself might not mean a huge amount to some of us, but if I can simply just point to the arrows that you see, and the arrows will indicate to you information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, cognitive sciences are all overlapping, And if they're all overlapping, that means new areas, new types of research, new types of applications are being produced. I'll simply point to a few of them. To my left, brain simulation, neuromorphic engineering, brain simulation. Do we understand what we mean by brain simulation? Right, brain simulation is a, right, I'm expecting to see some very animated persons at this point. Right, nanobiomedicine, nanobiotech, DNA computing. These are all possibilities that occur when we start to think about how these emerging disciplines now overlap one with the other. Now, let's quickly take a foray, let's quickly take a short visit into the realms of science fiction. Or is it? Because there is an organization in Russia, it's called the 2045 Strategic Social Initiative. Its founder is the gentleman, again to my left, Dmitry Itskov, and he and his group, who are not deluded, he's actually put together a group of scientists and engineers and futurists, and they have this as a very serious set of goals that by the year 2045, they and others of like mind, no pun intended, that didn't work. They and others of like mind want to develop avatars, very advanced avatars by that period. If you take a look at what they have for the goals for 2015 through 2020, a robotic copy of a human body remotely controlled via BCI. BCI is brain-computer interface. Now, that might sound like science fiction. Some of this is actually already occurring. Some of this is already occurring, and this is an area, these are areas of very serious research in a number of countries. Right. I'm saying this for a reason, because these considerations have implications for what we do in terms of our STEM education efforts. Okay. This might yet, at this point, be considered sci-fi. However, I'm reminded that as a child, how many of you are familiar with the original Star Trek? A few? If you watch the original Star Trek in the 1970s, much of what you saw, much of what was seen in that series was sci-fi and seemed impossible. And a number of what seemed impossible that is happening and has happened. Now, some of these already are in place, and here are some which are not science fiction, so personalized medicine, human biotech, neuroscience, neurogenomics, etc. So back to the question of socially responsible and contextualized STEM education. let me skip this example because I want to get to, where am I with time, please? Okay. No, all right. Nanotechnology. As I said, the manipulation of matter at that particular scale. What might be any of that? How relevant might any of that be for us? Well, there are rather groups who are proposing that nanotechnology and applications coming out of nanoscale science and engineering can be used, can be developed, can be applied specifically for developing countries. Here's an example. Here's one example. So nanotechnology for health monitoring for NCDs, non-communicable diseases, which disproportionately affect many of us in the Caribbean. Now, a question can be asked, or the proposal can be made, surely one should simply change their lifestyle and change their behavior. Right, and I'm seeing nods in agreement with that. Some people tend to be lazy in terms of their health. The nanotechnology industry has seen an opening in the market, has seen a niche area in the market where here's a group of people who tend to be affected, tend to be afflicted, tend to have developed these conditions. This certainly is a market for these types of products, these types of sensors, which tell you if your blood sugar is dangerously high, if your cholesterol level is dangerously high. You now no longer need to go and visit a clinic in order to find that out. You may have a subcutaneous sensor implanted which beeps or somehow gives you a signal which tells you too high, you now need to do something about it. Okay. Should we be thinking about integrating those types of concepts into, for example, the medical program here at UWI? Several other medical schools and medical colleges around the world are now beginning to incorporate nanomedicine concepts into their particular programs of study. For example, Virginia Tech now has an undergraduate degree in nanomedicine. Not a graduate degree, an undergraduate degree in nanomedicine. Right, so they've seen a demand in the market in terms of where this is what students think can be very useful for them in their future careers. They've gone ahead and developed the undergraduate degree in nanomedicine, which I understand is fully subscribed. Is this an example that we wish to take a look at in more detail and perhaps emulate? Not exactly, but perhaps take a leaf out of their book and others and apply these developments in a Caribbean context. Okay. In a Caribbean context, so are we ready in the Caribbean to deal or to engage with some of these issues, topics, and concerns or concepts? Okay. Here, I want to divert again, and I will apologize to the students of mine who are here because they've heard this story once or twice. And I call it the pepper sauce story. And in the picture, you'll see half-smiling lady who happens to be my mother. Thank you. And the child that she's holding is me. Now, at around the age of 12 or 13, I developed, don't know how, don't know why, I developed a taste for hot pepper sauce. So I'd put hot pepper sauce on every meal. I'd put hot pepper sauce on bread. I'd put hot pepper sauce in soup. I'd put hot pepper sauce in my hand and hot pepper sauce. And I remember my mother becoming very alarmed and very concerned about my passion, addiction to hot pepper sauce. And my mother said this to me: stop eating so much hot pepper sauce, because if you eat so much hot pepper sauce, it will give you a hot temper. If you eat so much hot pepper sauce, it will give you a hot temper. Now, at the age of 12, 13, whenever that was, I was already somewhat of a science person. So I stood there trying to figure out, what on earth does she... Hot sauce, hot temper. What's the correlation here? Right, I say that to say this. I say that to say this. My mother, who didn't complete secondary school, so didn't have much of a formal education, but had a store, had a store of these traditional sayings, or cultural sayings, or folk knowledge, or folk wisdom, and she'd come up with them at the strangest of times. That being one of them. 20 years later, or 25 years later, or thereabouts, I came across the work of Professor June George and Dr. Joyce Glasgow. I can see my colleagues in science education within the School of Education who are very well familiar with the work of George and Glasgow. Because Professor George and Dr. Glasgow undertook a very comprehensive study across, in particular countries in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago being one and Jamaica being the other. I believe there were other Caribbean nations also, in terms of looking at the relationships between Caribbean beliefs and how one understands, and the understanding of conventional science. So, just as my mother said to me, don't eat so much hot sauce, because that will give you a hot temper. They, in their work, in their research, cataloged a number of these types of beliefs. Here are a few of them. There are 20, there are 10 here and 10 on the next. I won't go through each and every one of them. Number 6, certain foods when eaten together will cause death, such as ripe bananas and rum. I don't know if anybody's heard any of these. If a man drinks a lot of sea moss, he'll become more virile or fertile. Number 10, that was my mother again. That was the advice she gave to one of my older sisters. Eat plenty of okras. You'll have, the childbirth will be much easier. Right, I can hear some of the responses here. If an expectant mother drinks a lot of milk, the baby will be light-colored. Right, again, these are some of the findings from George and Glasgow's work, which we're smiling and we find them humorous. However, the point is, these are seriously held beliefs. And how do those seriously held beliefs now overlap or now connect? How do we use those? Do we ignore them? Do we take them into account when we are trying to teach conventional, accepted, canonical science? Right. Is there a mismatch going on? Right. I won't go through any more. I'll simply say when I discuss some of these with my undergraduate students, so not even my graduate students who are somewhat older, when I discuss some of these with my undergraduate students who are in their late teens or early 20s, I'm a bit older than that now, they're familiar with some of these, which suggests to me that these pass on from generation to generation. All right. So, questions. Do these beliefs help or hinder our ability to understand conventional sciences? Do our traditional religious beliefs have any effect also? And what ought to be the areas of focus in STEM research and STEM education for us in the 21st century? That was raised very nicely here earlier this evening. Okay. A reference was made to something that appeared in the Gleaner this past weekend. And there are some examples that I do suggest ought to be included in our STEM teacher preparation programs within this faculty. And here are some of the examples. These are some of the examples I now discuss with some of my students to make them more aware of some of the developments going on, some of the developments that might reach the Caribbean at some point in the future and with which they need to be familiar. So we're familiar in the recent publications of these findings where Chinese scientists have genetically modified human embryos. And where the outcome has been that cognitive function might have been enhanced. This turned up in my news feed yesterday. So this is very recent. This was actually published last month, where a group of researchers, again at the university in southern China, right, I'm seeing some people are reading this, so we're not reading through all of it, have actually put human brain genes, encephalin, into the brains of these monkeys, macaque monkeys, and have found that cognitive function actually did measurably increase. Right. So yes, I'm trying to give examples that are dramatic and that are noteworthy. But again, the point being, these are no longer science fiction. These actually are occurring. We need to be aware of them, and we need to start incorporating some of these into how we deliver our programs of STEM education. Okay. Yet another example. Students of mine in the room will be familiar with this, because this is an exercise, this is an assignment that I have set now on 2 occasions, where I've asked my students to respond to these particular questions in terms of CRISPR and biotechnologies and nanotechnologies. How do you see these fitting into your teaching within the context of the national standards curriculum? Is there a place, are there places where they can be incorporated usefully? A bit too small for the audience to read. I wanted to try to fit everything on one slide. Just the first one, I'll read the first and the second ones. So using nanotech to solve environmental, medical, and other issues outweighs the disadvantages or any ethical issues that may arise. So the use of nanotech or biotech to improve environmental conditions will be most relevant to my classroom teaching within the NSC. Contrast that with another response. We within the Caribbean, we are not a highly scientific society. However, we are a highly religious one. Lack of resources can be attributed to the hindrance in scientific advancement. So we do have the capacity, the interest, but because of these particular factors, we aren't there as yet. All right, go. Also keep in mind, these are some of the big, larger topics, again, that I think we need to take into consideration in any discussion about STEM and STEM education and where this is all leading. Not where this is leading, where some of this has already gone. So, genomics. For example, the Human Genome Project, which was completed in 2003. And in the 16 years following 2003, a huge amount of information has come to light about the human genome. Can any of that now be applied to education? I will leave that, I'm giving that as a rhetorical question, but there are researchers who now are looking at this very, very, very seriously. If we can obtain a genetic analysis, genome analysis of myself, yourself, and if that analysis suggests a predisposition toward language facility or being mathematically inclined, or do we then use that information to track or stream or otherwise determine the educational career of students? And I'm seeing heads are shaking, and I'm not seeing anybody nodding. I'm seeing heads shaking, but this is being very seriously considered. We already track students, we already place students into particular avenues. This is just another more precise way of doing so. Okay. Right, and I have this because I wanted to make the point that STEM and some of these emerging technologies and some of these issues do very much need the role of the humanities and the social sciences for analysis, for greater explanation in terms of ethical, non-ethical. Should these, because we have the capacity to do these things, ought we to do them? Okay. Let me go forward. Let me take a moment to highlight, I want to mention Mr. Wellington in particular, because one of the things we are trying to do is to now develop our efforts toward outreach and linking with local, regional, and international groups, organizations, entities who might wish to work with us in terms of developing and promoting STEM education. Mr. Wellington is the founder of the Negril Education Environment Trust, NEET. And he is a teacher in every sense without being a certified teacher, but he is a teacher. He's a businessman and a teacher. And what he has done is to set up a program in Negril that really tries to positively impact, positively influence the lives of many, many children, many, many persons there. One of the goals is a tablet in every child's hand and a computer in every classroom. And he has done this, or is doing this, as a private effort. He's enlisting the help, enlisting the support of a number of entities. And he actually has asked for the University of the West Indies to become involved. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned him, because he also is interested in, here's my local effort, but we want to include some aspect of STEM education. Right. Let me just take a look at some other examples, and the examples I've chosen are those persons with whom I happen to be familiar professionally, who have expressed an interest in working with the University of the West Indies. So, my colleague, Dr. Cho, Namjoon Cho in Singapore, who's a chemical engineer, works in bioengineering, is interested in has developed a number of mobile science kits. Those already are present here. He and his group have developed, again, a number of mobile science kits that have been tested, they've been endorsed by UNESCO, they've been used in a UNESCO project, and he has asked, are we interested in partnering with him and his group? Similarly, Marco Corelli in Los Angeles, who has developed an extensive online repertoire for teaching and learning nanotechnology, again has asked for involvement, interest from the University of the West Indies. Right, so there are persons outside of our region who would like to work with us in moving this agenda forward. Right. Go forward. Okay. In wrapping up, let me also discuss or mention very briefly the specific efforts that we're taking in the Faculty of Humanities and Education, the School of Education more precisely. And this has been brought to our attention before. One of the things that we're trying to do at this point is now to enhance, to add to bring to the fore scholarship and research, trying to develop that body of scholarship and research in STEM education that we need as the research component to try to move us as a region forward. So this comes with the background from Jules Miller and Armstrong. Again, by 2020, we should be able to demonstrate a 30% increase in qualifications. Compare that with the Vice Chancellor's comments that we mentioned earlier on. I must acknowledge my co-editor, Dr. Lois George, who, with her assistance, she and I have been working together to move this forward, and the response has been extremely encouraging. How are we addressing these first three? I mentioned that earlier. So the first three recommendations that Ward suggests, these are encompassed within the plans to develop the Caribbean STEM Education Center. Now, whether that center will be a brick and mortar, whether it will be virtual in its composition, still remains to be determined. Those discussions, those deliberations are underway. A fundamental role, a key role, will be to assist, to help, to complement, to enhance the work of the Ministry of Education and to support the national standards curriculum here in Jamaica. So begin locally, but the goal ultimately is to expand that reach to education systems, curricula, science, STEM curricula throughout the region. So to act as a repository for resources that are accessible. So not just to university staff, teachers, college lecturers, the layperson. Right? This material, these types of resources need to be well collated, curated, validated, and made available. Right? This is where the thinking is this is where the thinking now is in terms of this Caribbean STEM Education Center. And work is moving ahead on that quite rapidly. Okay. That won't occur by itself. Right. It will take a number of persons, a number of entities, a number of organizations working together. And we tend to operate in these silos, both within a university and on a wider basis. But here I've listed some. This is not an exclusive list. I've listed who I think are some of the major players, some of the major stakeholders at this time to try to get this moving. So I've listed the key organizations. There are others, so please do not feel slighted if I have not included any particular organization. But these are the key organizations, as I see at this point, who must work together, who must come together in order to develop an integrated STEM education policy, firstly for this country, firstly for this nation. After that has occurred, or while that is occurring, there are scholars who have been looking at this and thinking about this and talking about this and publishing about this for some time now. So the thinking already is in place, a framework already is in place on which to build. So I do suggest that we build on one of the frameworks that already has been suggested in order to move this forward. And in conclusion, I will read this particular slide. So across the world, Jamaica is known for its pioneering spirit. And if we are serious about positioning Jamaica as a regional leader in STEM education, then we must assert the will to achieve this in a methodical and a timely manner. We must develop a clear, focused, and well-articulated STEM education agenda for Jamaica. We must. There is no discussion, there is no argument at this point. We must proceed thoughtfully and systematically, but with a sense of urgency, to improve STEM literacy, not just across Jamaica, but across the entire Caribbean region. I do submit to you that the time is now, the time is right, the time is appropriate. And if we have the will to do so and the passion to do so, then we need to begin the work now. With that, let me conclude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take this.
All right. Now that we are wrapping up, I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to allow for a couple of questions to Dr. Sweeney. If there are any burning questions given the time. Professor Taylor, I might start with you, only because I had prompted you a question. And so, but I'll open it to everyone, in all fairness to Prof. Taylor, to see if there's any questions. Yes. If you could just go quickly to see any of these microphones.
1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2.
Just one quick question. Where does STEM actually start? Does it start like university level or from apprentice stage, probably like daycare level or the kindergarten level? Where exactly does it start?
I would suggest from early childhood, from birth. Right, and I'm not being flippant in that response, in that reply.
1 2 1 2 1
A child
1 2.
upon birth, beginning to grow, beginning to develop, if you've ever observed a baby, is curious.
1 2.
What happens if I do this? What happens if I fall? There are always questions. There's the curiosity. Now you can build on the curiosity. So as early as possible is my short response to that. As early as possible.
Prof, I think I saw your hand up. Yes.
1 2.
Well, maybe I can speak from here.
Yes.
Oh, I can hear you very clearly.
Right.
1 2.
Well, thank you very much for your
Okay.
overview, Dr. Sweeney.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned STEM and STEAM and defined it quite well.
Yes.
And certainly the proponents of STEAM. STEM, just a comment and then a question.
Please.
STEM took a revision or a reinvigoration with the advent of the concept of the fourth industrial revolution. Coined by Professor Klaus Schwab in his 2016 book. And out of that, everybody got excited from the World Economic Forum. And STEAM now seemed to be a jealousy on the part of the people who felt left out because everyone was focusing on STEM. I would like to suggest that STEM is an emphasis.
All right.
STEAM now includes all the other stuff.
Yes.
And when you emphasize everything, you're not
emphasizing
anything. Therefore, I would put STEM rather than STEAM.
All right.
Because we realize there's a mismatch between what the marketplace needs in terms of jobs and what the educational institutions are producing in terms of the human capital.
Right.
And so that mismatch is where the STEM emphasis tried to fill. And so certainly we need to go there. But regionally, because we are a regionalized world, and we tend to live behind a border that's guarded by the hegemon, and the hegemon suffocates the growth of STEM in other parts of the world because it steals the cream of the human capital. How many science teachers have left our shores in the last 3 months? The university, being the thought leader, needs to be the one challenging these global mismatches and this global theft that suffocates STEM in 6 billion population centers of the world and maintains the hegemony of the scientific productivity in a 1 billion OECD populated world. We need not to be afraid as intellectual thought leaders to challenge these things. And I thought that's what I was going to be hearing this evening.
All right. We've heard it now, but I can relate to at least definitely the latter part of your comment. Students of mine here who haven't yet completed their degrees, graduate degrees, are being, I'm not sure if the term, you use the word stolen. I don't know if I'd be so radical to use the word stolen.
Taken without payment.
Taken without payment. Students of mine who have not as yet completed their master's, MEd degrees, Master of Education degrees in Science Education, are being snapped up, are being invited to go elsewhere. And some have yielded to the temptation. Now, so I can relate in part to much of what you're saying. Okay. No, I'll stop there. I'll stop there. I'll be politically correct at this point. At this point.
Go ahead.
1, 2.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Not that you are new.
No.
You will.
No.
I'm just welcoming you because of the topic
Thank you.
you have chosen to discuss.
Okay.
This is a topic that you were late. You should have started these discussions in 2007. And I'm wondering why you waited 12 years.
He wasn't here.
I wasn't here in 2000. If I was here, I would have, yes.
Because we needed this kind of discussions to help us engage nanotechnology and nanoscience, which we started preaching in 2007 from the Faculty of Science and Technology. At that time, that was not the name. Okay. But you were not here.
No, no, ma'am.
Now that you are here, and you tend to be preaching STEAM, if I got you well, although you gave the advantages of why we should keep on STEMing, but you were in your undertone preaching STEAM.
All right.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, I do believe that there are advantages to a STEAM approach. Yes, I do.
Okay. If that is the case, I want to support you in the sense that STEAM seems to be the way to go, because the application of STEM involves that A that converts STEM to STEAM. We cannot fully apply STEM to sustainable development level, especially in our kind of environment where that A plays a very important role. Let me just stop the story and go straight to the fact that bioethics already tells us that.
Okay.
Research, advancing in research towards sustainable application of STEM, we need ethics.
Okay. Agree.
And the coming to being of bioethics already shows that direction as the way to go. We still want to speak STEM. It's good, but I just want to give a few indicators so that you will help me, join me to propel the nanoscience and nanotechnology program, updated, the 2007 initial one, going to be updated. Okay. And I want you in my team. Okay. Because now it is STEAM. STEAM. Okay. Now let's look at the social responsibility and cultural context that you mentioned. It is our social responsibility. Everybody has social responsibility, whether scientists or those in humanities or social sciences. We all have social responsibilities. And these social responsibilities and how we play them impact on how we interpret our sciences.
True.
Whether we want to take it or not. Okay? The reactions of life. You are standing there. I'm talking now because I'm alive. I'm not dead like this chair. So the reactions that keep me able to do this, and you standing, they are occurring at the nanoscale level in our bodies. That being so, we have already started nanoscience.
Right.
It's just that we did not call it that. Okay. Having said that, and nanoscience has come to say, by the way, I research on yams a lot.
Yes, ma'am.
I am in the Faculty of Science. I'm the director of the Biotechnology Center. We are going to start preaching nano yams because we are doing it with the farmers, and they too will get concept and help us preach nano yams. We will explain what nano yams mean. But right now we're talking about since then. If we do not go forward pushing education, you talked about taking education to the next level.
Yes, ma'am.
If we do not include nano, we'll be left behind. Why? Because, especially medicine. Now you go, the things that read what your body data contain, they are in wristwatches now, bands like wristwatch. You just look at it, then you press something that tells your doctor.
Yes, yes.
You press something that tells your doctor. And in some cases, in some countries, your doctor, looking at that, can tell that you are here in Navy Hall standing and preaching. And talking, sorry.
Yes, yes.
So that's where we are going. That's where nanomedicine is going. So we can't but follow. It's a situation where we are past the stage whether we should embrace or not. Because while we are deciding to embrace or not, things are going.
True, true.
The knowledge is going. Science fiction has become real science, and things are developing. They're not waiting. At the nano level, it's so dynamic. The dynamism at the nano level is what makes it to do what we would have called impossible. That we're really there and we did not see it in our horizon. So it's not a question of are we ready in the Caribbean? Yes, we are. Because if we do not present it like that, in fact, we can't afford to delay. That is the thing. We can't afford to delay, so that we start imparting policies. Because policies have to be made as to how they are to be introduced, how to take them to the next level, how to come in. I was engaged recently in trying to form a CXC program, what do you call it?
Syllabus examination.
Syllabus for biotechnology.
Yes.
And at the initial stage, when we started talking of DNA, somebody said, no, we don't really want those children handling DNA, So there is that fear for DNA, which is not necessary because nobody handles DNA anyhow. And DNA itself, can be handled anyhow with the nature.
Right.
So that is one perspective that we need to address.
Prof, again, I want to advance us because we need to wrap up, okay?
Yes, I'm going to round up. It's just that it touched on an area where over the years,
You have a keen interest.
to say. So what are we going to do? Working together.
Okay. I'm
Working together. I mean that togetherness. We are in the era of multidisciplinarity. We cannot be saying, I am doing biology, I am doing physics, I am doing social science. You know, we cannot work together. We have to work together. That's the direction of knowledge, multidisciplinarity. And that is what we are going to follow. Yes, we are ready for this level of, in the Caribbean. Yes, we must start bringing up policies. Yes, we are ready to move forward with knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So you can work together. All right.
I'm extremely pleased to accept your invitation to work together. This would be extremely valuable, in my opinion. And it's something we do need to do. So, thank you.
So to keep with time, I am going to close us off. I do want to humbly thank Dr. Sweeney. If you know him, oh, sorry.
I'm very sorry. Just to add to what you were saying in terms of DNA testing and all that in school. No, I had mentioned earlier about the ministry getting involved with government mandates and pushing some of the agenda through the schools. So through the Economic Growth Council, one of the objectives is, and I have my paper to read from it, improving citizen security and public safety. One of the recommendations through the Ministry of Education is to expose our students from the high school level. I'm actually pushing for the primary level, for early forensic science teaching and learning, right? It is being accepted. We are looking at, there are a number of high schools overseas that are doing forensic science in the high schools. So this is what we're looking at, because we're wanting our students, and some of them actually know how to really get deep into research, how they really use their predictive skills to, you know, kind of look at how we can solve problems. So we're looking at areas for students in medical examiners, crime laboratory analysts, crime scene examiners, and we're giving them a number of you know, scenes for them to read and try to figure out who was the murderer, who did this, what not. Okay. So that's what we're actually pushing through the Ministry of Education, early intervention in some of these areas.
So thank you to everyone. You could have been anywhere else tonight, and we really appreciate staying with us through to the end. Thank you for the riveting questions. Dr. Sweeney, I especially thank you for delivering such a formidable lecture tonight. And moving the conversation now into a more integrated approach, into a future agenda as well. There's much work to be done, and we're ready to start now. So thank you very much. Have a good...
Let me add that when I did say the fate of the faculty was in your hands, in the end, you proved me to be someone we should have and repose our confidence in. Thank you, Dr. Sweeney.
Thank you, sir.
You made me proud. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a safe and wonderful night, and dry night.
And dry, yes.
Good food. Go to N2 right next door. There is food and drinks, just in case.